and welcome to Local Heroes from Tower Bridge. This week, all my heroes come from the southeast. These trains are rumbling into Vauxhall Station, and that huge building of concrete and green glass is the headquarters of MI6, which is rather appropriate really, because my next hero was a member of the Secret Service. He helped to restore Charles II to the throne, and he also did some experiments in long-distance voice communication. He lived right here, and his name was Samuel Morland.
Morland was very vain, but brilliant at opening and resealing letters without detection, so he got a job with the Secret Service. He overheard Oliver Cromwell's plot to kill the exiled Charles II and warned the king. When Charles returned, Morland became a royal favourite.
Morland was a bit of an inventor and was very interested in long-distance communication. Now, the horn as a signalling device had been around for a long time. Alexander the Great used one to summon his troops, allegedly from a range of 12 miles away. Morland wondered whether he could develop it for voice communication, and his greatest invention in 1670 was what he called the tuba stentorophonica.
Morland made his 7-foot megaphones from glass, but I wanted to test his 21-foot monster, originally made of copper. I've asked the London area Sea Cadets to help me. One party to row me half a mile upriver with a tuba stentorophonica, the other party to remain on shore to test reception of the signal.
Don't get in anything away. Just steps properly not on the oar, eh?
Samuel Pepys called Morland a fool, and I don't suppose messing about with 21-foot megaphones helped his reputation. But he claimed conversation was possible at 3/4 of a mile.
Good. Oh! Okay, Sea Cadets, megaphone up, please. That's good. Okay, now let's get it nicely lined up. Back to me a bit, please.
To me.
Thank you. I'm going to call some letters of the alphabet. Please make the appropriate semaphore signals. Up a bit, Bad. Up a bit at your end, thank you. Delta! Echo! Charlie! Since the 17th century, a fair amount of research has been done into how megaphones actually work, and there seem to be two things going on. The first is a more efficient transfer of energy from me to the air, and the second is better directionality. Now, the wavelength of my speech is about a few inches. I mean, that much to that much, depending on how high I speak. That's about the same size as the width of my mouth. That means there's a lot of diffraction. It spreads out in all directions all around my head. You can hear me behind. But if I can speak from a much bigger mouth, which is what I'm doing because it's 2 foot wide at the other end, then there's much less diffraction. It doesn't spread out all over the place. It goes in the direction I'm talking. So we've got better transfer of energy, better direction. Romeo!
On one occasion, Morland arranged to have the King, Prince Rupert and various nobility standing at one end of the Mall. They could hear him speaking through his horn from the other end of the Mall, half a mile away.
Charles II was very keen on science. On the 14th of August 1681, he summoned Morland and gave him a gold medal studded with diamonds, hung on a green ribbon, and it said on it, Magister Mechanicorum, Master of Mechanics.
Good standard is...
Although he invented many silly things, including a portable clockwork kitchen, his pumps were really good. He once sent a jet of water coloured with red wine over 60 feet above the top of Windsor Castle.
Samuel Morland was an ingenious chap, although a bit of a fool. However, he did do one brave thing. He saved the king's life. And it's as a result of Charles II's gratitude that we know the name of Samuel Morland, Magister Mechanicorum. Oxford Street probably looked rather different 190 years ago, which was when my next hero had a stationery business, right here. He was interested in all sorts of communication. He invented writing machines and devices to help the blind, but he was bothered about copying. If he wrote a letter to somebody and wanted a copy, he simply had to write the whole thing out again. So he came up with carbon paper. His name was Ralph Wedgwood. What he did was to make carbon dust by grinding up bits of coal or charcoal or something like that, and I'm just grinding up this bit of coal with sandpaper, and you need quite a lot. And when he had got enough for the moment, then he would mix that up with vegetable oil, and here we've got a bowl, and then little slurp of vegetable oil, and it's important not to put too much in, otherwise it's too thin. And then that needs thoroughly mixing up with a wooden spoon to make a nice smooth paste. A bit like making pudding, really. Okay, now the next stage is to get a brush, and here we are, here's a brush, and just get this on a piece of paper. Here's an ordinary piece of paper, and I'm going to paint this onto the paper. And I don't want it too thick, and I don't want it too thin. And what's got to happen is that we've got this spread out all over the paper, and then it has to be left to dry, sort of overnight, something like that. And some of it, I expect, dries, and some of the oil soaks into the bulk of the paper, leaving the carbon as a thin film on top. And what happens once it's thoroughly dry is that it winds up more or less like this. And that is carbon paper, and you can see that that was the bare side and that's the carbon side. And just to show you how brilliantly it works, here's a bit of ordinary paper, and that's going underneath the carbon paper, and here's another bit of ordinary paper on top, and I will write on there, and of course the only sensible thing to write is the hero's name, Ralph Wedgwood. All right, and just look at this, that's the original, and with his own process, there is the copy. And isn't that amazing? Ralph Wedgwood's carbon paper, 1806. This is the Royal Society, founded by Charles II in 1660 for discussion of matters philosophical. It was a sort of scientific gentleman's club. They began to get into trouble at the end of the 19th century when a whole lot of brilliant women scientists turned up. Marie Curie came here, but she wasn't allowed to read her own paper to the members. She had to sit in the front row. Her husband read the paper, and when everyone asked questions, they asked him, he asked her, she told him the answers, and he shouted them back. The first woman who was allowed to read her own paper in front of the Royal Society in 1904 was Hertha Ayrton. She was born Phoebe Sarah Marks, but later changed her name to Hertha. She became an ardent supporter of the suffragette movement, not surprising when you discover that the Royal Society didn't consider it legal to elect a married woman who was regarded as the property of her husband. She started her scientific research at Finsbury Tech, where she married the professor and sorted out why arc lamps make so much noise. But her real breakthrough came in the autumn of 1901, when she came here to Margate, not for a holiday, but to study the ripples in the sand. Little did Hertha know that her work on the beach would end up saving lives on the battlefield. She realized there was a paradox. When waves break, the water flows up and down the beach, which you might expect to flatten ripples rather than create them. She had to do an experiment. Then one afternoon, she caused her landlady some astonishment, even shock, by demanding her bath in front of the fire, not in the evening, but in the afternoon. What she wanted to do was not have a bath, but try and make some sand ripples. And I've got the same experiment set up here, and you can see that I've got some sand and some water. And what I'm going to try and do is make some ripples in the sand just by sloshing the water backwards and forwards. I'm doing it quite gently. Now it's beginning to get very interesting just about here. You can see there's a little dent forming, and if you look in the dent, you can see each time the water goes over it, there's a vortex, a little spinning sort of horizontal whirlpool of water, which picks up sand and shifts it out of the hollow and onto the hump either side. Just by slopping the water up and down, I've created vortexes, so the moment you begin to get a bump, you tend to get more bumps one after the other.
Sand ripples formed the subject of that paper she read to the Royal Society in 1904, and the crucial thing she'd shown was that just with a flow of water, she could create a vortex. But how could all that possibly save lives? Everyone was worried about British troops in northern France, and particularly the threat from poison gas. Hertha must have been thinking about the problem of clearing gas from the trenches.
On the 6th of May, she went to deliver another paper about ripples to the Royal Society, and it was in the taxi on the way back to her flat that she suddenly had a brilliant idea. Okay, fine, thanks.
I've set up my trench in the pub in Norfolk Gardens, which may have been Hertha's local.
In her observations at Margate, she'd seen that a current in the sea could create a vortex, and that would make a ripple in the sand. And she realised she might be able to run the experiment backwards, as it were, and that if she made a vortex, she might create a current in the air which would push the poison gas out of the trenches. So the moment she got home, she wasted no time. She said to her maid, "No visitors." She rushed upstairs, she got a table, and she set up a little miniature trench, just like I have here, with sandbags here and at the end, and a device for making poison gas. So let's make some poison gas. We need a bit of this. Dry ice should do it. A bit of beer here, just to set it off.
Hertha found that the best vortices were made by flapping something against a solid surface.
And then she needed a fan, so for her first experiment she took a postcard and she stuck it on the end of a pencil, or just like that, and then she simply flapped on the end of the trench like this, and just look at that. Look at that, I'm not clapping hard, and I can stop it in its tracks. But if you flap continuously, you can drive it right back over the enemy lines. And the idea was that as the fan hit the end of the trench or the ground, you created a vortex, and that in turn made a current which went in that direction. And she was so amazed by how well it worked that she laughed aloud, she said, at the simplicity of the idea. She reckoned that any squaddy could operate one of her flappers, and 104,000 of them were sent out to the trenches. They were called Ayrton fans or Ayrton flappers.
The full-size flapper was made of canvas and designed to fold up for carrying. It was a brilliantly simple idea, but the flapper had to be used properly. Sadly, many of the 104,000 were shipped without instructions and ended up as firewood.
When I think about what characterises my heroes, it's usually some amazing invention or brilliant scientific idea. But this chap's rather harder to pin down. He was born right here in Woolwich, and his first job at the age of 12 was at the arsenal packing cartridges. He was a powder monkey. But he went on to become a very skilled metal worker, in fact so skilled that all the greatest engineers of his age depended on him, and his ideas of how things should be made revolutionised the engineering industry. His name was Henry Maudslay.
As a lad, Henry went to work at the same place as his dad, who had been invalided out of the army and was a storekeeper at Woolwich.
When Henry was 15, he went to work for a blacksmith here still at the arsenal, and he became a very, very skilled metal worker. Everyone else seemed to be fighting against the iron, but he loved it and he worked with it, and soon his skill and his reputation spread miles beyond Woolwich.
Joseph Brammer, the brilliant engineer from Barnsley, had invented an unpickable lock, but couldn't find anyone to make it. Someone told him about a gifted blacksmith in Woolwich, and Maudslay persuaded Brammer to let him have a go. Maudsley's lock was exhibited by Bramah in his shop window in Piccadilly, with a sign offering 200 guineas to anyone who could pick it. 63 years later, an American called Hobbs succeeded in 44 hours spread over 16 days.
Maudsley became Bramah's foreman, and for 8 years he ran his workshop, and he made the machines to manufacture those brilliant unpickable locks. He also married Bramah's housekeeper and had 2 children. By 1797 he was still getting only 30 shillings a week, £1.50. So he asked Bramah for a raise, and Bramah said no. So Maudsley left and he set up on his own in Wells Street.
And I'm going to set myself up on the site of Maudsley's works.
It was a bit of a problem at the time with blocks, pulley blocks like this, which are really good for lifting and hauling things, especially on ships.
In fact, blocks were so useful that each 72-gun warship needed 922 of them, and the Navy used 100,000 blocks a year.
Now this was one of the sort of blocks they actually used. This is a 10-inch block. The outside, the shell, is made of elm, and the middle bit, the pulley or sheave, is made of lignum vitae, a very hard wood, and in the middle there's a pin, which used to be lignum vitae or iron. This is iron, and at that end you can see it's square. It does it so it won't turn inside the shell, and the whole lot's hung from the rigging like that. And these were made by tailors of Southampton, 100,000 a year, all made by hand. And the bits, of course, didn't always fit terribly well, and there were stories, when they caused too much friction, of the blocks catching fire in the rigging.
Mark Brunel, father to Isambard, realised that precision mass production of the blocks was the answer, and dreamed up an assembly line of 43 machines to do it. Brunel wanted to make models of his revolutionary machines, but needed the best possible engineer. Someone introduced him to Maudsley.
Brunel was very secretive about it, so when he first came to Maudsley, he said, "Will you make a model of this machine, please?" But he didn't tell him what it was for. Well, he came back the next day, and Maudsley had made that one, and Brunel gave him the drawings for the second machine, and Maudsley said, "Oh, I see, you want to make pulley blocks." So then Brunel realised he was a very bright chap, and he gave him the contract to make the whole lot. Now, I've set up my block-making machine here in Lambeth North Tube Station because this was the site that Maudsley eventually set up his famous firm of Maudsley, Sons and Field. What he was making for Brunel was blocks like this. Here's the sheave, here's the shell, there's the sheave, the pulleys in the middle, and this would of course have been made of elm and so on. And I'm starting with blocks of solid elm like that. Well, actually this is balsa wood because it's a bit easier. So the first machine would have cut the elm into blocks. The second one would drill 2 holes in the block like that, and the third one has got to cut those into slots or mortices for the sheaves or pulley wheels to run in. And this is how I'm going to do it with this machine here. Now you'll see at the bottom there are 2 chisels, and I want those to go up and down like that, up and down, up and down. And I do that by turning this handle with my right hand. But of course, they're not making any impression on the wood because it's not moving, so I'm turning this handle here to drive the block forward under the chisels. So here we are, both hands at once. It's a bit like trying to rub your head and stroke your tummy at the same time. Now, I reckon those mortises are cut, so now I'm going to take this block out. I've cut those mortises, and the next stage comes on the lathe.
Every machine-made part was identical, and they were entirely interchangeable. It was the first mechanised production line. To convince the Admiralty, Maudsley and Brunel knew that they would have to make not just a machined block, but a machined version of the handmade blocks, correct in every detail, only cheaper and better.
Now, I've got this massive weight here, which I'm going to try and pull up with these blocks that I've just made. Look at that, terrific. They work really well. You can see that the mechanised way of making blocks is absolutely brilliant. But when Brunel took these models to tailors, they said, no, we've been experimenting for years. We've spent hundreds of pounds a year perfecting the best way of making blocks. It's not possible any machines could be better. They were wrong. By 1807, all the Admiralty's blocks were being made by Maudsley's machines. and Brunel's fee for this was 1 year's worth of the money they saved. That was £17,663 and 19 shillings, an absolutely phenomenal amount of money.
While looking into Maudslay's story, I made an amazing discovery. This is Portsmouth Naval Dockyard, home of Nelson's Victory. It's the same vintage as Maudsley, and you can see why blocks might have been important. This disused building near the Victory is the old block mill, and amazingly inside there are still a few of Maudsley's original machines as installed in 1804. In fact, they kept going until the late 1960s.
What Henry Maudsley really invented was the idea of precision engineering, of going on and on, getting things more and more accurate. His memorial says he was distinguished as an engineer for mathematical accuracy and beauty of construction, and as a friend for a kind and benevolent heart. I've biked down here through the snow to visit one of my favourite monuments in the whole of London. No, not the Houses of Parliament, not even the Festival Hall here. No, what I'm interested in is under the bridge. Come and have a look at this. It's terrific. This magnificent stone is in fact the bottom stone of a horse mill that was used on this very site 200 years ago in the manufacture of the best artificial stone in the world. And the woman who made it was not only a gifted artist, a brilliant chemist, and an astute businesswoman, she changed the face of London, and indeed most of the rest of the country. Her name was Eleanor Coade.
Eleanor Coade moved to London from Exeter, and in 1769 set up in Lambeth as a maker of artificial stone. To be respectable, she followed normal practice and called herself Mrs. Coade. I'm at Buckingham Palace because she did some of the decorative stonework, sadly round the back where I'm not allowed. She also did this magnificent and rather sad lion on Westminster Bridge near the site of her gallery, and the crest on the Imperial War Museum. Coade stone was very fashionable and important in the 18th century. I wanted to find out how Mrs. Coade had done it.
So, this is the workshop, is it?
The recipe had been lost for 200 years, but Coade stone is being made again in deepest Somerset. Philip Thomason is the man who discovered Eleanor Coade's secret. Coade stone is a ceramic and is made from various clays, ground glass and what they call grog, rougher ground up stuff including ceramic to hold it all together.
Okay, Philip, tell me what's going on in here.
This is a statue of Flora, which is being finished and modelled.
She's terrific.
But the whole process really starts here with the filling of the mould.
So this is plaster, the mould's made of plaster.
The mould is made of plaster, and the soft clay, as you can see, it's quite...
Oh, it's really squidgy.
It's quite a soft material.
Oh, yeah.
It's being pushed with some serious effort into the mould. They emerge from the mould looking quite crude.
Right.
But, as I say, structurally
sound and soft enough to work by hand.
And soft enough to be modelled and finished.
The Coade stone mixture is fairly rough, and that's how it looks when it emerges from the mould after a few hours. The skill is in working detail into the surface and getting it perfectly smooth. Once the artist is happy, it's time for a bit of chemistry. The transformation from soft, workable clay happens in the kiln. Coade stone is fired at a temperature of about 1100 Celsius for up to a week. Mrs. Coade's own kiln was big enough to take several statues at once, including the giant figure of the river god Thames. This 200-year-old statue shows why Eleanor Coade was so great, combining artistic excellence with technological brilliance.
Well, here we have an example of Coade stone at its best. This statue is as good as the day it left the kiln. The quality and finish is still as good as ever, and the sensitive modelling of the leaves and flowers in the headdress show no signs whatsoever of any erosion. To me, it's the finest quality of terracotta ever produced anywhere in the world.
codestone's so durable that there are more than 650 pieces still all over the world. Indeed, the entrance to the zoo at Rio de Janeiro is covered with codestone, so if you're there, please send me a postcard. Now this is at the Royal Naval College at Greenwich. It's called the Nelson Pediment, and it commemorates Nelson's sea battles. Of all the pieces they made, this one is what the code workers reckoned was the finest of all their work. My next hero was born in Como in Italy in 1844. He came over to England, he married Mildred Barber, had a daughter, lived in Clerkenwell, and set up as a manufacturer of looking glasses. He had one shop down there at number 11 Hoxton Street, this is in Hackney, and then he moved up here to what is now St Monica's Primary School. In 1896, he invented a device so cunning that I'm amazed you don't see it all the time in your local swimming pool. His name was Liborio Pedrazzoli. Mr. Pedrazzoli was obviously a very keen swimmer, and what he invented was this, swimming umbrellas. Now the idea is that when you go forward through the water it stays small, but when you pull back it opens out wide in the water, so you get a tremendous grip on the water, and it enables you, he said, to attain velocities hitherto impossible. Now, I've made them, but I haven't tried them out yet, and there's only one way to find out whether they work or not. Ah, right. Lost my specs, I'll find them later. Now then. Oh yes, it's quite interesting.
In his patent, he explains very clearly what happens and also displays his Italian roots. He says, the apparati close when the hands are thrust forward, thereby causing but little resistance or obstruction. But when the return stroke is made, the apparati expand in umbrella form, and the resistance thus offered enables the swimmer to pull or propel himself through the water.
The difficulty is doing a long enough stroke to get them properly inflated. They take about a foot to fill up, then you get a really good grip. I obviously need a bit more practice because I've got better even while I've been in the pool. But thank you, Mr. Pedrazzoli. Nice idea, but actually I think I'm better off without them. Oh. Sorry, that's all the heroes for this week. See you next time!